Okay, we're live now.
Okay. Oh wait, somebody's in the waiting room.
Yes, I just
Okay.
admitted them.
Okay.
Maybe we'll get some folks rolling in a little late.
Yeah, I think I'm maybe going to give it a couple more minutes.
Yeah, that might be a good idea.
Okay. So if you're here, we're just going to give it a few more minutes to see if people trickle in a little bit more, since we had more registrants than are currently present. So we will just give it a couple more minutes, but thank you if you're joining us.
Okay, we have someone joining us on Facebook Live, so maybe we'll get some
Great.
more folks trickling in there as well.
Okay.
So yeah, maybe we'll give it another minute or so and see if we get some other folks trickling in,
Sounds good.
and then get going.
Perfect. Might go ahead and get started. What do you think, Hillary?
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I'll just keep monitoring things and admit folks if folks trickle in a little bit late. But at the very least, like you said, we'll go ahead and present because we are recording this, not recording it live on Zoom, but we will be sharing the presentation later on our YouTube channel.
Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Audrey. Today we're going to be doing a little bit of a talk on climate change, something that I've always been very interested in and kind of always want to talk about more because I think that it's missing from a lot of our conversations often. So yeah, we're gonna talk today kind of about some of the basics of climate change science, just to make sure we're kind of on the same page in terms of some of those basic things like the greenhouse effect, and how that works, as well as some of the terminology surrounding climate science. And then we'll talk a little bit about how climate change is expected to affect river systems like the Eno. And finally, we'll kind of focus pretty heavily on climate change communication at the end, which is a really kind of fascinating field of study that's continually evolving, and some like tips on how to communicate climate change more effectively. But just a few housekeeping things. If you are joining us on Facebook Live, there is a little bit of a delay there, so just be aware of that if you're asking questions or whatever. If you do have questions, definitely feel free to, if y'all could remain muted throughout the presentation, that would be awesome. And then if you have questions, you can either put them in the chat or I'll give kind of a few opportunities to ask those questions. And Hillary will be monitoring kind of throughout, keeping an eye on the chat, all of that. If you have any questions for her or anything like that, feel free to ask. And I think that's it. I'll probably be talking it'll be just under an hour, I imagine. So yeah, so let's go ahead and jump in. Ooh. So just an brief introduction to myself. If you've been with me before on any of our previous lunch and learns, then I've already kind of done this, but My name's Audrey. I am an AmeriCorps member serving as an environmental educator at the Eno River Association. My background's mostly in wildlife, conservation, biology, and but I'm also just interested in like general environmental education and outreach, and I'm really passionate about getting people to talk about certain issues and become kind of involved and feel, helping people to feel empowered to take action and make changes in their communities. So we're just going to jump right in because there's kind of a lot to talk about today. So like I said, we're going to start with climate change basics. So what is climate change? It can be defined as a systematic change in the long-term state of the atmosphere over multiple decades or longer. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware, some people kind of mix up sometimes unintentionally, might mix up the terms weather and climate. I'm sure that most of us here know that weather is very different from climate, and that weather refers to short-term atmospheric conditions, while climate refers to the weather of a specific region averaged over a long period of time. Some people kind of, use those interchangeably. And it's just, important to understand that kind of difference. It's kind of all about the timing, right? So climate is over a long period of time, whereas weather is just kind of short-term atmospheric conditions. Okay, and then global warming versus climate change. So these are two phrases that are often used interchangeably. But that's not necessarily accurate, although they are obviously very closely linked. So global warming refers to the recent rise in the global average temperature near the Earth's surface, but it represents really just one aspect of climate change. So while global warming refers to those rising global temperatures, climate change refers to increasing changes in the measures of climate over a long period of time, including precipitation, temperature, and wind patterns. So that can include effects like rising sea levels, shrinking glaciers, accelerating ice melt, and shifts in like blooming times of certain plants and things like that. So it can kind of include a wide array of different effects. Now, I will say too that some have argued like that the terms global warming and climate change aren't effective in getting the message across that we're trying to get across. So some like scientists and climate change communicators have argued for different phrases to be used, like global heating, global climate disruption, the climate crisis, as opposed to climate change. Because as we'll talk about later, the words that we use are really important when it comes, especially to tricky topics like climate change. So just kind of an interesting thing to note that like some people argue that we should be referring to these things as like different terminology. So I want to talk about the Earth energy balance and the greenhouse effect, because obviously this is extremely important when we're talking about climate change. But a lot of people, might not fully understand it or might have misconceptions about it. But the Earth's temperature is really dependent on that balance of energy between energy entering the planet system and energy leaving the planet system. So when sunlight approaches the Earth, it can either be reflected back into space by the atmosphere or by Earth's surface. So things like bright surfaces like ice and clouds are really effective at reflecting energy back into space. But the other option when sunlight approaches the Earth is that it is absorbed by the Earth. So it's not reflected, it's absorbed. And that's what happens to most radiation. So most of it is absorbed by the Earth's surface. And when solar energy is absorbed by the Earth, it warms the planet. Once it's absorbed, it's converted into heat. And that leads to the emission of what we call infrared radiation. And then the Earth releases some of the infrared radiation back into the atmosphere. So some of this infrared radiation that's released back to the atmosphere will pass through the atmosphere and will be lost into space. But at the same time, greenhouse gas molecules in the atmosphere are going to trap some of this infrared radiation by absorbing it. So they're capable of absorbing that heat and then re-emitting it back to Earth's surface. So it like bounces back down. So you can kind of see that over here with this depiction. So some of it goes up into the atmosphere and back down into Earth's surface. Some of it circulates throughout the atmosphere, and some of it is lost into space. Oh gosh. So oftentimes people describe these heat trapping greenhouse gases, which we'll talk more about in just a moment, as a blanket that is wrapped around the Earth. It's important to note that this is the greenhouse effect is a natural phenomenon. It's important to ensuring that the Earth stays warm enough for us to survive. So it's a natural phenomenon. However, when there are increased levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere as a result of human activities, this means that more infrared radiation is going to be trapped. So in other words, that blanket around the Earth becomes thicker. So it really like kind of makes sense logically when we think about global warming, because we know that greenhouse gases like methane, carbon dioxide, and the others that we'll talk about today, that they trap heat, right? We know this, and we know that we're producing more of them through our activities. So it makes sense that if we're producing more of them and they trap heat, that we're going to have increasing temperatures throughout the Earth. Okay, so now I just want to talk a little bit about what the greenhouse gases are. We won't go like into too much detail, but I think that some people, we recently did a quiz on our Instagram stories, and some people just didn't know that like water vapor, for example, is a greenhouse gas. So I just want to talk a little bit about these greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide, I'm sure we're all aware of, makes up to 80% of US greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see that on the chart over here to the left. So most enters the atmosphere with the burning of fossil fuels, right? And then it's also removed from the atmosphere and stored when it's absorbed by plants, soils, animals, and the ocean as part of the carbon cycle. Methane is the second most common greenhouse gas emitted by humans, and it makes up to about 10-11% of greenhouse gas emissions. So most methane comes from raising livestock, but it also is released some when burning fossil fuels. And then it's also emitted when organic waste like food breaks down and decays in landfills. So that's why when we talk about like composting and food waste and things like that, like it's a pretty large contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. Now methane, if you look at the chart on the right here, you'll see that methane is actually a more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And what I mean by that is just that it's more capable, or it's capable of trapping more heat and causing more warming, just because of its chemical makeup. But it's emitted in smaller quantities, which is why it doesn't make up a bigger part of this chart. Now, nitrous oxide makes up about somewhere around 6% of US greenhouse gas emissions, and most of that is emitted by agricultural activities like applying fertilizer, but it can also come from burning fossil fuels. So, and it's even more powerful, as you can see in the graph on the right, it's even more powerful than methane and carbon dioxide at trapping heat. Then we have fluorinated gases. So these make up only 3% of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. They are really powerful at really good at trapping heat. And they actually stay in the atmosphere for a very long time, sometimes thousands of years. And they're different from the other greenhouse gases that we've talked about in the sense that they're not natural, they are man-made. So they're used for like air conditioning, cooler refrigerators or freezers or buildings, and then can also be used inside products like foams and aerosol cans. Okay, so that's that. So what about water vapor? Water vapor is in fact a greenhouse gas, but it is different in that obviously it's not like emitted by humans through various activities. Instead, water vapor represents what climatologists call a positive feedback. So you can see kind of over here in the diagram on the right. So climate feedbacks are basically these natural processes that respond to global warming by either offsetting global warming, so causing it to decrease, or further increasing global warming and the change in the climate system. So feedbacks that offset the change in climate are called negative feedbacks, while feedbacks that amplify those changes are called positive feedbacks. So it's kind of like counterintuitive because we hear the word positive and often we think it's something good, but in this case, it's kind of the opposite. So those positive feedbacks, like water vapor, increase the warming, global warming. So water vapor, as you can see in the chart on the left, is really thought to be the most important positive climate feedback. And so basically as the earth warms, the rate of evaporation and the amount of water vapor in the air both increase. Warmer air can hold more water vapor in it. And because water vapor is a greenhouse gas, so it's capable of trapping infrared radiation, this leads to further warming. So it's actually by far the most abundant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, both by weight and by volume. It's just not really talked about as much because it's not like emitted by humans through these like human activity. So it just has kind of a less direct correlation to human activity and is instead kind of, like I said, that kind of feedback from our activities that are already causing global warming. But it's still incredibly important to have as part of the conversation and to kind of like understand. Okay. So now we're going to talk about how humans are causing climate change. So even though the greenhouse effect is natural and greenhouse gases are naturally occurring, human activities are, as most of us here probably know, are drastically increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, which is in turn leading to global temperature rises. So first and foremost, we've got the burning of fossil fuels. So a fossil fuel is a hydrocarbon containing material that is formed underground from the decomposition of dead plants and animals. And then humans extract that and they burn it to release energy for use. So the main examples of fossil fuels are coal, oil or petroleum, and natural gas. And it's important to note that fossil fuels are non-renewable, but they currently supply around 80% of the world's energy. And fossil fuels have really been found to be the dominant cause of global warming, as I'm sure you've all heard before. So the burning of fossil fuels began during the Industrial Revolution when the first coal-powered steam engine was invented in the 1700s. And since then, it's steadily increased. So each year, we now burn over 4,000 times the amount of fossil fuels that were burnt during the year 1776. In 2018, 89% of global carbon dioxide emissions came from fossil fuels in industry. So it's burning of fossil fuels is obviously like playing a huge role in climate change. If you look at the chart on the right, it just kind of breaks down each economic sector and then it tells you which fossil fuels are being burned by those sectors. So this was for the year 2020, and you can see that natural gas is used a lot in the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors, and some in the electric power sector. Obviously with transportation, it's using a lot of oil. And then electric power is kind of like, almost half and half using coal and natural gas. And then the chart on the right kind of shows you the breakdown. This tends to vary year to year, but you can see kind of what each sector is contributing to total greenhouse gas emissions. So agriculture is really the smallest, around 10 or 11%. Electricity and industry, those ones that really use fossil fuels a lot, are producing a huge amount of our total greenhouse gas emissions. So back to kind of other ways that humans are causing global warming. Another thing to consider is deforestation. So when forests are growing, any photosynthesis exceeds respiration, and any surplus carbon is stored in tree trunks and roots in the soil. And this is called carbon sequestration. But when forests are cut down, a lot of that stored carbon is released back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So this deforestation is thought to have the potential to make up to about 10% of carbon dioxide emissions caused by human activity. So it can play a really big role in like releasing huge amounts of carbon dioxide that was previously being stored for us by these, these trees and the soil. Now agriculture, with agriculture, you have to consider that, before reaching our plates, our food is produced, it's stored, it's processed, it's packaged, it's transported, it's prepared, it's served. And at every stage, greenhouse gases are released into the atmosphere at varying degrees. So there's a long process before that food reaches our plate that people often don't really think about. And farming in particular releases significant amounts of methane and nitrous oxide. So methane is produced by livestock during digestion due to their fermentation process, and it's released via gas. So cow farts, right, and belches produce a lot of methane, which, as we know, is a greenhouse gas. And then nitrous oxide emissions are also indirect products of fertilizer, certain fertilizers. So agriculture has the potential to contribute about 10.5% of total US greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about does anybody have any questions or comments? Are we okay in terms of that?
I have not seen any questions or comments yet from any folks, but feel free to put them in the chat if, and that goes for Zoom and Facebook. Feel free to put them in the chat.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so climate change and rivers. So we're just going to talk about how obviously climate change is projected to affect every kind of aspect of our world, right? So I wanted to hone in a little bit and talk more specifically about how it could affect river systems. And this is not like a comprehensive assessment of that, but I wanted to talk about like a few key points. So first, water quantity. So I'll talk about water quantity, water quality, and then also like some more specific effects on flora and fauna. So water quantity, droughts and flooding, right? So a key element of climate change is its impact on the Earth's water cycle. So global warming is fundamentally altering the water cycle. It's shifting precipitation patterns, and also it's making the availability of precipitation less predictable. So the atmospheric capacity to hold moisture, as I mentioned earlier, it increases greatly with temperature. And that leads to increased amounts of water vapor in the atmosphere, which leads to a greater capacity for heavy precipitation events and floods. So overall, climate change is leading to a much more active water cycle that involves both increased evaporation and increased precipitation. So basically, with increased evaporation and increased precipitation, dry areas are kind of expected to get drier and wet areas are expected to get more wet. In many areas, rainfall has already become increasingly abundant, leading to more extreme storms and floods, while in other areas, rainfall is in shorter supply relative to long-time averages. So when we're looking at river systems, extreme weather events that like dump excessive amounts of rainfall onto headwater regions can cause really bad, devastating floods pretty far from the source of the heaviest precipitation, as rivers kind of swell and the floodwaters disperse all the way down the system. So even if we have a big rain event farther away from us, with river systems and everything being connected, there's the potential for that flood to reach places that are farther away. Now, water quality. So I'm going to just read a quote really quick that says, impaired water quality is a global and growing problem, limiting resources for drinking, domestic use, food production, and recreation, as well as harming ecosystems. So water quality is a really big deal. It's a big problem. It's, easily affected by a lot of different factors. So basically, when we're talking about climate change and water quality, we can think about both floods and droughts and how that might affect water quality. So extreme rainfall events can lead to a lot of runoff because the soil isn't able to absorb the precipitation at the fast rate that it's falling. And in like more developed areas and urban areas, suburban areas, agricultural areas, this runoff is going to pick up pollutants from the landscape and carry them to nearby rivers and other waterways. And then also, it's important to think about the fact that in some areas they have older stormwater systems. So the stormwater runoff and sewage in those systems are transported together through the same single pipe system. And extreme rain events can actually overwhelm those systems and spill raw sewage into nearby streams and rivers, which is obviously really not good. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, frequent droughts, so and lower amounts of rainfall and increased evaporation, that can lead to reduced water levels in our streams and rivers, which can leave less water to dilute even like pretty common pollutants out of the river and stream. So kind of either way you look at it, when we're really shifting those precipitation patterns, it has the ability, like the capacity to really affect water quality in rivers and streams. Now, more specifically, like some more specific ways that climate change is projected to affect like the plants and animals that live in and around the Eno. These are just like kind of a few of those ways, but algal blooms are one. So higher temperatures make an environment that's more suitable for more frequent algal blooms. And those algal blooms can reduce dissolved oxygen levels in the water, and can lead to fish kills and just other harmful things throughout the ecosystem, throughout the river. Cold water species can also obviously be displaced as air temperatures rise, water temperatures rise, especially in those shallower areas of the river, and streams may become unsuitable for cold water species. So we have some species in the Eno, for example, the Neuse River water dog needs colder temperatures in order to survive. So like as those water temperatures increase, that's not going to look good for cold water species. Then we have some effects on reproduction. So for example, like rising amounts of precipitation, if there's a really severe flood, it can do things like wash away eggs that have been laid. So if we're having more frequent flooding events and heavy rain, that's going to make it less likely that eggs that have been laid are able to survive, right? If they're washed away, it's unlikely that they will survive and hatch and reach maturity. And then we have stress, so just general stress that's placed on certain species. So when stream flows start to peak earlier in the spring because of warming temperatures, low stream flow would begin earlier in the summer and last longer into the fall. And those changes can stress aquatic plants and animals that have kind of adapted to specific flow conditions. And there are other ways, warmer temperatures can definitely just induce stress in organisms. And then we have disease. So we talked a little bit about like when sewage, there are definitely scenarios in which raw sewage is washed into streams and rivers. And in those cases, it can absolutely lead to disease outbreaks from waterborne bacteria. So that's really another thing to consider. So these are all, like, again, this is not a comprehensive list, but these are all ways that we could expect expect the Eno to be impacted potentially in the future by climate change. And some of those may be, a more steady progression of negative consequences, or it may be, a quicker onset than we're expecting. So let's move into climate change communication, which, once again, as I said, is something that I find really kind of fascinating to talk about and to learn about and to think about, like why it's such a difficult topic for some people to grasp and to believe and to do something about. So let's get into it. So according to the Yale program on climate change communication, on the surface, climate change communication is about educating, informing, warning, persuading, mobilizing, and solving this critical problem. At a deeper level, climate change communication is shaped by our different experiences, mental and cultural models, and underlying values and world views. So as we all know, climate change is a really tricky subject. There are tons of factors at play. So from politics to knowledge to worldviews to social values to past experiences to priorities, all of those things, climate change communicators really have to navigate those various factors. Not to mention that climate change itself is just a difficult thing to engage people on because it's pretty intangible and abstract, and people often feel like it's distant and like it won't really affect them. Even if they're concerned about it, they may just feel like hopeless and kind of like at a loss of what to do, or they may feel like, well, it's going to harm other people, but like I don't need to specifically be concerned about it. And honestly, there have been some pretty big missteps in the past with regards to climate change communication that have put us in kind of a trickier position today. So it's kind of been framed in certain ways in the past that has led to a lot of polarization. It's been tied, very closely to the environmentalism movement. And of course, it's a part of that. But by proxy, people who are like, put off by environmentalists and environmental activists, they're automatically going to like not want to talk about climate change, not want to believe in climate change. But really, climate change is tied to our economy. It's tied to public health. It's tied to all sorts of things that really require everybody's attention, right? But because of the way it's been framed, people don't see it that way. They have a hard time seeing it in that kind of multi-tiered way. And then it's hard too with climate change communication. I think often it lacks clarity and it lacks like a single, way of talking about it. I think that climate change communicators can really struggle with like getting their main points across and kind of putting it across clearly and concisely because it is so multivalent and it has so many levels to it. I also want to mention that some cognitive psychologists argue that evolutionarily, we're not really wired to deal with large scale problems like climate change and can engage with those kind of bigger problems, mostly only by breaking them down into individual tasks. So basically like the strategies that we adapted to deal with certain scenarios in the past in our hunter-gatherer kind of lifestyles, they aren't effective in dealing with such a complex, multivalent, ever-changing threat like climate change. So we have to work even harder to come up with ways to make that meaningful progress. Okay, so this is Global Warming Six Americas. So in 2008, using nationally representative survey data on global warming beliefs, behaviors, and policy preferences in the United States, the YALE program on climate change communication identified 6 distinct groups of Americans who they then tracked through a series of national surveys. So they established these 6 groups. So first is the alarmed. These people are convinced that global warming is happening, that it's human caused, and that it's an urgent threat, and they strongly support climate policies. However, most of these people do not know what they or others can do to help solve the problem. Then there's the concerned. So this group thinks that human caused global warming is happening, is a serious threat, and they support climate policies. However, they tend to believe that climate impacts are still like distant in both time and space. And it's just kind of a lower priority issue for them because of that. And then there's the cautious who really haven't made up their minds. They don't know if they believe global warming is happening, if it's human caused, if it's serious. So they're just kind of like, I don't know. There's the disengaged who know very little about global warming media. They're just kind of like totally away from it. Then we have the doubtful, who do not think that global warming is happening, or they believe it's just a natural cycle. And they really don't think much about the issue or consider it to be a serious threat. And then finally, there's the dismissive, who believe that global warming is not happening, it's not human caused, it's not a threat. And most of these people endorse conspiracy theories such as global warming is a hoax. So let's look at this chart. So this kind of shows you that as of 2021, the largest group was the alarmed, which is a good thing. So about a third of Americans were in the alarmed category based on their survey collection and the models that they developed to make these estimates. And then close behind is the concerned, with about a quarter of individuals in that category. And then comes the next biggest group, which is the cautious, so don't really know what they believe. And then kind of the disengaged, the doubtful, and the dismissive tend to make up the smaller kinds of groups. So let's look at this chart. So this chart is kind of like confusing. I took a still of it that I'll show in a second, but if you want to like watch it do its thing, then you can. So you'll see that the largest group, the concerned, grew quickly from 2013 to 2015, but has declined slightly since then. And then the alarmed, in contrast to that, experienced more rapid growth during the past 5 years than any of the other groups. And then meanwhile, the cautious, the doubtful, the dismissive have been shrinking in recent years. So that's kind of a still of that timeline. So I think that I'll stay here for a sec. I think that it's important to note that like there aren't just two opposite ends of the spectrum. There are tons of people in between, right? So this is a quote from, I'm going to quote in this next part of my talk, I'm going to be quoting from a few things, but largely from this book, which is called Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. It's by George Marshall. And it's really interesting and talks about just kind of like how our brains respond to this threat and other, it's just a very multifaceted and interesting book. But the quote from that book that I was going to read is that the constant goading of the aggressive deniers over the past 20 years has led campaigners and scientists alike to invest too much of their emotional energy into this single struggle and to forget that there is an infinite number of different stories that have yet to be told. The real battle for mass action will not be won through enemy narratives. We need to find narratives based on cooperation, mutual interests, and our common humanity. So I just think that's like interesting to note, because we'll often, maybe not often, I will often see things in the media that make it seem like there's this huge group of people who vehemently deny climate change and, think that scientists are making it up for professional gain or whatever. And I just think it's important to not fixate on that small group of people, because it is a small group based on research. And there are so many other people who have different perspectives, and there are different ways of like communicating with those people and trying to like move the pendulum kind of to understanding the threat of climate change, as opposed to really focusing on people who really you're not going to make any progress with, right? Because they're so steadfast in their belief that climate change doesn't exist or whatever. So, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I just wanted to show some of these maps. So these are called these are the YALE climate opinion maps. So I believe Hillary is going to put in the chat a link to this website. If you haven't seen it before, you may have, but I just find it super interesting. So this first slide says, this is the estimated percent of adults who think that global warming is happening. So the national average is about 72%. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit on North Carolina in a few minutes here. But first, we're just going to do the whole US. So Now, comparatively, this is the estimated percent of adults who think global warming is mostly caused by human activities. So 57%. So that goes from 72 to 57%. You can see the coloration difference. And that to me is just pretty fascinating. So those may be people who think that it's not. But you know, there's a huge percentage, 65% of people are, you know, never talking about it, or like very, very rarely talking about it, which is crazy. I mean, it's just, it's, you know, it's something that like I understand, because some people, I think it's like, well, what is there to say? It's like this huge problem. It's overwhelming. But I just, you know, research has shown that conversations are incredibly important in promoting social change, in developing social norms, and helping people learn key information. And they can be super influential to people. Even when I have conversations about climate change with like my partner who is on the same page about climate change as I am, like we'll like teach each other things when we're talking about it. Or like come up with questions when we're having those conversations that we then we're like, oh, I don't know the answer to that. And so then we find out the answer. So I just think that they can be these conversations between, you know, with peers, with friends, with family, with neighbors can be more valuable than we might think. And I just think it's really important that we talk about climate change, because it is such a pervasive, big issue that's going, you know, affecting us all and will affect us all. So, oh, this is interesting too. So this is the percent of people who think that global warming will harm people in the US. So 64%. But then this is the percentage who think that global warming will harm them personally. So once again, there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance there, where people think, you know, that they won't be directly harmed by it, which is just something that needs to be addressed. You know, it's like, and it's not to say that we need to scare people, because as I'll talk about later, fear is not really a motivator for action, but like, you know, it's just interesting to think about how a lot of people feel like it's going to affect someone, but it won't be them. Because I think it's just hard for us to process that. So this is zooming in a little bit closer on North Carolina. So those same first two questions, estimated percent who think that global warming is happening. So it's about 79% in Durham County. And then estimated percent of adults who think global warming is mostly caused by human activities, about 64% in Durham County. So Orange County is a little bit higher for both of those as well. So higher than the national average, which is good. And then when we come to this one, who estimated percent of adults who discuss global warming at least occasionally, it's about 39% in Durham County. So about above 4 from the national average, but still that's a pretty low number of people to be talking about such a prevalent, important issue. Okay. So let's move into some climate change communication tips. So here's a quote from the book that I mentioned. So there's no one size fits all approach to the challenges of communicating about climate change. Each of the many challenges presents a new opportunity to improve the way we present climate change information and the actions required to fight it. So that's just to say, once again, like just to echo that, there's really no like overarching approach that we can implement to teach everyone about climate change and make everyone concerned, right? It's an extremely varied thing. So I think one of the things to really take into consideration here is the concept of the two brains, which is a dual process model of like perception and information processing that was first described by Seymour Epstein. And for our purposes, we'll call these two sides of the brain, the rational brain and the emotional brain. And both of these play a role in climate change communication, although to varying degrees. So this is something that I didn't know, but for the first 10 or 15 years after climate change first emerged and was really being talked about, people's understanding of the underlying science was the single most powerful predictor of their willingness to change their behavior or to support certain government policies. But then the issue started becoming very polluted and muddled with political and cultural meaning. And by the year 2010, number of people who said they didn't grasp climate change science and climate change itself had fallen to just 3%. But at that point, people's views were being formed largely based on their political orientation, which really has to do with more with people's, not with their knowledge, but with their attitudes, their beliefs, their worldviews, their socialization, things like that. Now, by this point, a theory called the information deficit model had already been formed, which posited that people who are skeptical of or deny climate change, they just don't have enough information, and they don't have a clear understanding of the issue. So some people theorize that you just had to keep throwing more information at them, and eventually they would have like a light bulb moment and come to understand that climate change is a threat, and then they would be moved to action. But in reality, over time, knowledge and understanding has become less and less important, while values, attitudes, worldviews, socialization, and those types of things have become the primary drivers of, a given individual stance on climate change. So, and actually, research shows that oppositional views, like very oppositional views, can rarely be challenged effectively by new information. And if anything, trying to introduce new information is likely to reinforce their oppositional stance. And here's another quote here from a professor and scientist that says, denial is due to a surplus of culture rather than a deficit of information. So we've kind of moved away from that information deficit model. Of course, it's important to continue to disseminate accurate scientific information, of course. But it's even more important to understand how to communicate these concepts with different groups of people who have different backgrounds and worldviews and motivations and priorities. So here's one more quote from the book that I read by George Marshall. So climate change communicators need to maintain enough of the data and evidence to satisfy the rational brain that they are a credible source, but they also need to translate that data into a form that will engage and motivate the emotional brain using the tools of immediacy, proximity, social meaning, stories, and metaphors that draw on experience. So with that being said, let's go into our 5 main tips for climate change communication. So, and these tips can be applied, for someone who's going to speak at an event about climate change, or if you're just trying to have a conversation with, a family member or whatever it may be. So number 1, be a confident communicator. So first of all, the messenger is often more important than the message. That's been shown time and time again. It's talked about a lot in climate change communication. And one of the key qualities that people look for in a communicator and a messenger is integrity. They look for someone who they can trust, someone who's honest, someone who is confident in what they say and knows what they're talking about. Of course, it's okay to not know the answer to everything. And in those cases, it's just important to be honest. But this really involves being a competent communicator, really involves knowing and understanding the climate change science and being prepared for certain questions or concerns, and just doing your best to if you're going to go into a conversation, you're going to try to have a conversation with someone, or you have an event that you have to speak at, or whatever it might be. Just do your research and make sure that you can confidently convey what it is that you're trying to say. Number 2 is keep it simple. So don't overcomplicate things or use super technical terms if it's not necessary. Of course, you don't want to come off as condescending by any means. That's not what I'm suggesting. But, if you're trying to get a point across, work on getting that main point across and don't overcomplicate it. And another quote from the book says, what climate change really needs are the voices of ordinary people who might not be fluent speakers or skilled orators, but who can bring authenticity and a genuine sense of common ownership to the issue. So basically just saying, we need a lot more voices here, and it's not just the voices of scientists and academics and environmentalists and educators. It's also just other people who are concerned and want to talk about it. And I think just keeping things simple and trying to get your main points across, and like I said, not overcomplicating it is very important. Okay, this one is key, and if you've read or learned about climate change communication before, you've probably seen this, but knowing your audience is like so important. So as I've said many times now, people have different concerns, different priorities, different backgrounds, different worldviews, all those different things. And climate change communicators have to be aware going into a conversation or a speech or event, you know, who it is that they'll be engaging with, and then determine what the best way to do that is. And obviously that's like easier said than done. But, you know, I think it's important to keep in mind that like, we all want the same basic things. Often with climate change communication, we feel like we have to introduce new values to people and make them care, like really care about plants or animals or, you know, whatever. But at the end of the day, we all want a planet to live on. You know, we all want a better future for our children. We all want our health. We all want, you know, a good, healthy economy. Most people have very similar baseline values. So it's a matter of starting with those values and showing how they connect to climate change. So, and this can also play, I just want to say that this can also play into kind of the words we use. So if there's a term that can be defined in different ways, make sure that you're on the same page about what you mean when you use that word, or you can just avoid using it altogether. So I think the word like uncertain plays a big role in like people who don't believe in climate change or whatever, but really like the basis of the scientific process is hinged on like uncertainty. Like you're never 100% certain, right? Because it's the scientific process. So it means something different to different people. Like even if you say like 97% of scientists agree that, which is true, over 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is happening and that it's caused by humans, there are going to be people who fixate on that 3%, right? Who don't. There are 100% going to be people focused on that. So don't focus on like the uncertainty and things, but focus on, you know, what you do know and connecting with, you know, your specific audience. Okay. And then use stories and metaphors. So our perception of risk, which is, it plays a huge role in getting people to act on something, is dominated by our emotional brain. It really favors proximity, personal experiences, images and stories that speak to existing values. So storytelling is extremely important when it comes to communicating complex topics like climate change, because this is the way that most people understand the world. It's through anecdotes and stories rather than statistics and graphs. So stories are really the mechanism by which the emotional brain makes sense of the information that's collected by the rational brain. So just as an example of this, scientists who connect their professional work to their personal lives and their values are much more successful at getting their message across. So an example is Katharine Hayhoe. Some of you may have heard of her or not, but she's like kind of a pretty famous climate scientist. And I think she's a really excellent climate change communicator. And she connects, in some of her talks, she connects her decision to study climate science to her faith as an evangelical Christian. And that led her to want to help people. And that's why she studies climate change and tries to talk to people about climate change, you know, is because she wants to help people. And I think that's how most people concerned about climate change are, but it's like we forget to convey that, and we forget to connect it to, you know, our personal stories, and like remind people that like we're human, we're not like, you know, in this for profit or something like that. Like, you know, we are concerned and want to help people. And metaphors can be really effective too. So one example of a metaphor that people seem to respond to is, like I was saying earlier with the greenhouse effect, people seem to respond and like be able to comprehend the fact, like the blanket metaphor for the greenhouse effect. So describing it as a heat trapping blanket that gets thicker with more greenhouse gases seems to be a pretty effective metaphor. And then also some scientists will describe climate change with the metaphor of loaded dice. So they'll say like, while it's still difficult to predict where and when weather events will happen, climate change is loading the dice, making some types of extreme weather even more likely. So that's just kind of another example. And then lastly, I'm almost finished. I know I'm running out of time. Lastly, create a balance between talking about the scary parts of climate change or whatever with hope and optimism, right? Focus on hope. Of course, it's true that we're in a scary position. If we continue on the trajectory that we're on, things are not going to look good for us. And it's important to be aware of this. But generally, although fear gets our attention, it has never been, or not never maybe, but it's typically not what triggers us, moves us to action, right? It gets our attention. It doesn't get us to do anything about it. So scaring people into action is not typically effective. See the fear appeal as you being manipulative. And then additionally, people have what's called a finite pool of worry. And that just means that people's capacity for worrying about problems is limited, and it's rationed to certain things. So, I want to say, especially right now during this time, with a pandemic and all of that, people have a lot of emotionally charged issues to worry about. And the result can be this kind of emotional numbing, which is like a way of protecting yourself by being indifferent to issues that are not of immediate concern to you, which is of course reasonable. If you're worrying about putting food on the table and all of that, like you're not going to be concerned about, you're not going to spend your time worrying about climate change. Like that just doesn't make sense. But with all that being said, hope is a very positive and very powerful emotion, and has been found to be more effective in spurring people to action. So hope is kind of a mechanism to turn fear into something productive. So it's important that we balance the facts with hope and like a vision for the future that is achievable with human action and collaboration. And that concludes the main part of the talk. I just wanted to, first, before I go into this, does anybody have any questions or comments? This is just a brief thing that an interesting study that I was going to mention and provide a link for.
I don't see any questions or comments through Facebook or Zoom currently.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Hillary. Well, if you're interested, thank you, everyone who's stuck through me with this. And if you need to go, obviously that's totally fine. But this is an interesting study that was actually conducted at NC State by one of my professors and one of his students, actually two of my professors. And it's on intergenerational learning. And I just think it provides a really kind of thought-provoking way of like moving things forward with climate change communication. So intergenerational learning is just passing knowledge between different generations. So children and adults or grandparents or whatever it might be, it can go either way. But in this case, they studied the potential for children to communicate climate change, children's ability to communicate a climate change curriculum that they had learned in school, and how they could pass that information on to their parents. And I just want to like quickly highlight that, and this was done in, well, like I said, in North Carolina and some coastal communities, and it was done with middle schoolers. And they had 4 key findings. First, children who participated. So there was like a control group and a treatment group, as is in most studies, where like the treatment group had this climate change curriculum, the specific curriculum that they had to teach, and the control group didn't. But children who participated in the intergenerational learning curriculum showed larger increases in climate change concern than the control students. Children in the treatment group fostered more climate change concern among their parents than kids in the control group. Changes in parents' climate change concern were most pronounced among groups that are typically more resistant to climate change communication. In other words, the politically conservative. And then also, interestingly, daughters were more effective than sons in fostering climate change concern among parents. So I think that this is just a really interesting like way of looking at this. And it shows you that intergenerational learning is possible, even with tricky things like climate change, but also like the fact that when you have conversations with family members who trust you, and who, especially if you're not coming across as like judging them or getting angry with their beliefs, even though it might be difficult to not do that sometimes, I think that you can have a very successful line of communication in trying to get these concepts across. So basically the students in the treatment groups, their parents developed more concern for climate change over this period of time. I believe it was like a 2-year period. In this, yeah, this kind of, I had a conversation with my partner's father recently, who's very politically conservative, and really just, and he, you know, doesn't believe that climate change is happening. And I really just tried to, I like asked him questions about why he felt that way, like, you know, what his priorities were, how they related to climate change. And we had a really great, productive conversation. At the end of it, he talked for like an hour, and he said, you know, that I had given him things to think about, you know. So anyway, that's just like an example from me personally, on how you can kind of have these really difficult conversations, using certain strategies to have more effective communication. So thank you everyone who stayed. And yeah, if there are any questions or thoughts or anything, please feel free to share, but otherwise you are all free to go. And we'll post this recording on our Facebook and YouTube channel at a later date. But thank you everyone who's here.